Hello everyone, thank you for joining the latest of our Closomat webinars delivered by the OT service. As you can see, this one is Hoisting, Challenges, Impacts and Design Considerations, presented by myself, Adam Ferry. I'm an occupational therapist. I'm one of the directors of the OT service. Just want to make it clear from the start that in the time that we have, this is a very brief summary of my reflections of the topic, with some bits of information that I hope you'll find interesting and you'll find useful to take forward and reflect on. We don't have the time for an in-depth, like a real deep dive into some of the topics. So I'm hoping that it just sort of whets your appetite, allow you to go and explore them in more depth. And wherever possible, I'll reference some of the other webinars we've delivered for Closomat, so you can go and explore those things in more depth in your own time. If you've got different experiences to me and different reflections, that is absolutely fine. I just hope there's something you can take away. So what we're going to do in the next half hour or so is consider the challenge of determining when it's the right time to hoist. I think that's a really important starting point. We're going to develop an understanding of what risk assessment is, how we do it, how we apply it. Reflect on the impact of hoisting on occupation. I think that, again, is a really important learning outcome for the webinar. Whilst everybody listening to this might not be an occupational therapist, I clearly am an occupational therapist, and I think it's important that we bring everything back to occupation. Understand hoisting options and environmental design. So assessing risk, where and when do we hoist? I've done that as the starting point because I think we're all quite familiar with the idea of tile risk assessment. So I haven't gone into huge amounts of depth about tile in this. We delivered a different webinar for Closomat about proportionate handling. So the idea of single-handed care or proportionate handling. And in that, we talked in much more depth about tile and how to apply it. So please take a look at that webinar on the YouTube, on Closomat's YouTube channel or on their website. And I'm sure someone will put the link to that also in the chat box. But we're quite familiar with the idea of that, the impact of the load. So in this case, the person being hoisted or moved, the equipment, the environment, the task, what it is we're doing. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but we understand tile as a risk assessment. I think what I'm going to with this is that by the time we get to that tile risk assessment, there's probably already been a determination of what the person needs. So it's a consequence of a decision. So it might be that the person's being discharged from hospital, or the person has their needs have changed within the home environment or within the care environment. And we're going with that idea that the person now needs to be hoisted. How do I write that as a risk assessment and ultimately leading to a handling plan? So I want to rewind a little bit for now and just determine, how do we decide when somebody needs to be hoisted, or even when they're moving from being ambulant to less ambulant and needing aids or support in any way. And I think that's a really tricky decision, but sometimes something we don't necessarily often pay a lot of time determining. I think maybe because of some of the equipment that's been available in the past, or historically what's happened within an organization, what the culture of the organization is. We can often go from sit to stand or needing support with a sit to stand with a carer or care provider and skip the mechanical standing hoist element quite quickly, depending on what our experiences with mechanical stand aids are, and therefore go to hoisting, full passive hoisting in some format, without necessarily understanding what the equipment in between does or how it's meant to be used. I'm going to come on to equipment and specifics later, but I wanted just to highlight the fact that tile, in my experience, ends up being the end product of a decision that's already been made. So how do we get to that decision in the first place? Now, when we're delivering moving and handling training, we deliver in conjunction with A1 Risk Solutions. We talk about the mobility assessment tool, the MAT, and what it does is it allows a therapist or a clinician in the first instance to be able to, or someone within a care agency who has been trained to, as a moving handling lead, say, for example, it's a good way of making that decision and rationalizing the decision about when somebody stops being independently transferring or needs some support, and taking you through that process of level of support required. So, for example, as you can see on that screen there, if you start at the top, somebody who is able to perform those certain tasks, and actually this is very, from an OT perspective, it is very activity analysis focused. Somebody who's able to perform those basic tasks, you move down to the next level. If they're able to perform those next tasks, you move on to the next level, and down, and so on and so forth. So that at some point you get to the level of actually this is what they can't do, and therefore this level determines what type of equipment the person uses. The other good thing about the MAT is that it accounts for variations in the day. I don't know what your reflections or experiences are, but I think there is very little, certainly in the community, in the way of at this time of the day, the person is likely to need X, but at that time of the day, the person is likely to need Y. And I've heard a lot, and I probably said it myself when I worked in an acute setting, that you plan for the lowest denominator. So if somebody needs to be hoisted, say first thing in the morning, but they could manage with a non-mechanical stand aid in the evening, then the lowest denominator is the passive hoist, and therefore that's what happens with their transfers. One of the reasons for that might be equipment storage. You might have a few different bits of equipment needed to manage that, but also probably, if you're not going to do that, then you're relying on carers to make that judgment because of fluctuations. But again, this kind of tool is very straightforward for carers to use and allows them an evidence base to be able to make a decision at any one time about what type of equipment the person would need during that visit. There's another document that I haven't put on the screen there, which is maps out the day. So from an assessment perspective, you can use the color codes on this to map out. In the morning, the person always needs this. When we've attended at lunchtime, the person has needed that. And that's red, amber, yellow, and green. So from an assessment perspective, you can very clearly determine what fluctuations there are, if any, through the day, and then put a plan in place, an appropriate plan in place to manage those needs at different times. So it accounts for variations in the day. It definitely helps carers to make decision based on need rather than an assumption of there being some sort of lowest common denominator. And it ensures that the risk assessment is person-centered. So it's very much based on what that person needs at any one time. It's only one of the tools available, and it would just feed into the overall risk assessment process. But I wanted to use something like that to reflect on how we get to the decision of that final handling plan in the first place. So have we gone through that process of determining what somebody needs at different times of day, depending on their condition? So some of the obvious conditions would be things like MS, Parkinson's. They're very fluctuant through the day, depending on when medication is taken, depending on fatigue, depending on environmental controls such as temperature and all those sorts of things. So how do we, when we talk about things being person-centered, how actually are they? So as occupational therapists, how am I making sure that this plan is person-centered? whilst managing risk and supporting engagement. And remember, what is a risk assessment? So yes, it's a process that identifies potential hazards and evaluates the consequences of those hazards. But they should always lead to the least restrictive solution. So they shouldn't inhibit activity. They should support activity in a way that's as safe as it can be, or where risk is just mitigated. So determining what risk is acceptable to people is quite difficult, especially in a time where we think much more about litigation, we think much more about what happens if it goes wrong. Really, that's just about our documentation and what our clinical reasoning is for making certain decisions. Nothing more than that. As long as our documentation and our clinical reasoning is robust, there's nothing else that you need to worry about. So different clients, different service users will have different levels of tolerance of what risk they want to accept in order to also allow them to engage in meaningful activity. So it's remembering that the risk assessment should always remain the least restrictive. Engaging in any activity has inherent risk, and it should not inhibit but support. We take that back to another kind of analogy of, let's say, I don't know, when our children are young, we don't let them cross the road. But does that mean they never cross the road? Of course it doesn't. How do we mitigate that risk? We mitigate that risk by when they get to a certain age, when they're able to process information, we teach them how to cross the road safely. Everything we do has inherent risk, everything we engage in. So it's ensuring that the risk assessment helps people to engage rather than hinder it. So let's think about the challenges of hoisting in the home environment. I'm going to come on to different types of equipment shortly. Physical space constraints is certainly a challenge, particularly in domestic environments. And again, that depends on what we're using. So, but depending on what we're using, we need to be thinking about turning circles, thoroughfares, what the platform spaces are, all those sorts of things. How do we get the person from A to B? Carer burden, are carers or informal carers providing these tasks? And actually, what I always find interesting when we're delivering training or providing moving and handling support for local authorities is that difference around what we'll allow or accept an informal carer to do, and whereas you've got formal care agencies saying, no, we won't do that, or we wouldn't do that. And the distinct difference between the two. And I know there's reasons for that, but hoisting in the home environment, if the person particularly is living with someone, can cause a significant carer burden. User safety, so linking to carer burden in some ways. So what knowledge and skills do the person doing the hoisting have? But that includes formal carers. You could argue that in the home environment, there are more variables. So the ability to control the competency of carers, whether formal or informal, is more challenging. You might have more people coming and going. Care agencies have more staff turnaround. So maintaining that is a challenge. And we're meant to be reviewing moving and handling plans on a regular basis. So, as a minimum once every 6 months, I would suggest, but resources within the profession and within authorities generally tend to not allow for that to happen on a proactive basis. It's much more likely that things are reviewed based on reaction to an event or reaction to carer feedback. The psychological impact of hoisting in the home environment, so the person who's being hoisted feeling like they're lacking control, feeling like they're having something done to them, and the psychological impact of the person that they're living with. So the changes in those roles. So we think about, some of our occupational theory and role theory. If the roles are changing very much within the home environment, whether the person's being hoisted or not, that has a psychological impact. And they're things that we need to try and certainly acknowledge and then consider as part of our plans wherever we possibly can. And of course, the cost of hoisting in the home environment and accessibility of equipment. We do a lot of work with local authorities around single-handed and proportionate handling care to try and reduce some of those costs. But one of the things we talk openly with those authorities about is how accessible is the equipment needed to be able to do that. And that certainly is a challenge within the domestic environment. But there are significant opportunities with hoisting, some of which are the counter to what we've just talked about. So increasing safety. So if the person has been performing activities that has created significant risk, then actually hoisting in any shape or form. So when I'm talking about hoisting here, I'm not just talking about full body passive hoisting. Hoisting in any way could be seen as increasing safety and allowing the person to engage in the activity. And that might reduce carer strain. So actually somebody might have been really panicking about their relative who's been trying to stand, who's been falling all the time, and they've been having to pick the person up off the floor or deal with the stress of all that. And actually you're able to provide a really robust, proportionate solution which reduces that risk. It can be time effective if done in the right way, certainly with the right techniques, the right training, and the right equipment. And it can be used to maximize independence. And it's one of the things sometimes that we're not the best at. Certainly when it comes to passive hoisting, is considering how hoisting impacts on occupation and how we can maximize independence within it in ways rather than just saying, well, the person can press the up and down button on the handset. That's very minimal independence and control. There are lots of other ways in which hoisting techniques can be used and adapted or adopted to maximize independence, not just with the transfer, but with occupational engagement. So that's what we've moved on to. So I've used need, want, and expectation there as the heading for an important reason. The World Federation described occupation being about need, want, and expectation. Need from a hoisting perspective can be very much about that risk assessment and reducing risk. So risk is needed to be reduced, and we do that in a certain way with whatever equipment we recommend. But want and expectation are things that aren't inherently built into that risk assessment, I don't think, or often enough anyway. If we think about the tile risk assessment, how often are we talking about the service user, the client, the person wants to be able to do and achieve? Their expectations of engaging in roles are X, Y, and Z. And this is how we're going to support that within the risk assessment and the handling plan. So whilst we might be covering a need, covering want and expectation from an occupational perspective, if we're occupational therapists doing that assessment and writing that plan, is very important. And I think that's why it might differ depending on which healthcare professionals or which trained people are delivering that risk assessment and handling plan. So let's have a brief look at what occupations are impacted on by hoisting. So I'm going to use self-care, productivity and leisure, so very much OT language, but it makes it quite self-explanatory to everyone. So self-care, how does it impact toileting? Consider people's access to the toilet with hoisting and what it is that they're waiting for. So think about how often you've used the toilet today, and then think what it would feel like if you could only use it whenever a carer was there. So if it's a formal care package, you might be looking at maximum, say 4 times a day, standard. So if you could only use the actual toilet 4 times a day, or maybe even not the toilet, the physical toilet, maybe it's a commode by the bedside, how would that make you feel? How would it impact dignity? How would it impact the respect you had for others and for yourself? Some of that might be impacted on what the handling plan says. So if hoisting can be done by one person, that might open up the opportunity for that person who's living at home to be able to do that for them, so that the person can use the toilet whenever they want to or need to or are expected to. I'm not going to cover single-handed care in any detail because, like I say, we have a proportionate handling webinar which you can access for that. General hygiene, so how is that being managed? Is the person being dressed and washed on the bed? Are they being transferred to a shower chair and then taken through? What if they've always preferred a bath? The access from hoisting to shower seems to be a natural thing, a natural progression, but actually, what if the person wants and expects to be able to bathe? How are we building that in as part of the plan? And how are we justifying that to through DFG, say, for example? How is the person grooming? So brushing their teeth, brushing their hair, putting their makeup on, all those sorts of things. Are we still supporting their normal daily routine, whether that's getting them to a dressing table, whether it's getting them to a sink, and a sink that they can actually access rather than one that they have to be 2 meters away from and lean into towards the sink? So that's from a hoisting perspective, it's if we're hoisting them down onto something that's then being moved, or they're being hoisted on a ceiling track system that's taking them from room to room. It's what is the person then doing when they get there, and how are we supporting them to achieve it? And some of that's about the activity analysis, about what their sitting balance is like, what they're needing to sit on, for example. But some of it is about us paying more attention to that being a person-centered plan. How are they eating? Drinking is an obvious one. Sometimes that comes with posture and us making assumptions that if somebody's needing to be hoisted in a certain way, that means they need to sit in a certain way or in a certain place. And that affects eating and drinking. And intimacy. Just because somebody's being hoisted does not mean that they aren't wanting to maintain an intimate relationship. And how are we supporting them to do that? But some of those things are presumptions we jump to as soon as somebody's being hoisted and aren't often included within the handling plan in depth. Productivity, if the person is of working age or is retired and has hobbies, although we'll come on to that in leisure. How are we supporting that with hoisting? Now, one of the challenges will be what is the work, if they're going out to a workplace and being hoisted at home, how is that happening at work? Do we spend enough time thinking about vocation for people who are hoisted, or do we make an assumption that the person's going to be in their wheelchair for that period of time? Meal preparation, again, the person who's being hoisted, is there an assumption being made that that stuff's going to be done for them? Or are we spending enough time thinking about how kitchen can be adapted to support them to do that? It's just not making the assumptions that someone's being hoisted, therefore these things will not happen. And how are their roles still productive? I put roles in there because I thought it was probably just the best place to put it from an explanation perspective. So where is the role of grandfather, grandmother, mother, father, auntie, uncle, friend? How are we still supporting those things? Or how are we providing the person with the information, advice, and support to make educated decisions in order to fulfill those roles whilst also being hoisted? Because we think about hoisting in the home environment generally fairly well. But how do we support the person to do that elsewhere? And leisure. So hoisting really inhibits leisure activities in however the person's being hoisted. Because, like I say, hoisting tends to be restricted to the home environment. And then if the person's been going in a wheelchair, we then start to think about wheelchair accessible vehicles and the person staying in the wheelchair, which I totally understand. I'm not saying that that's inappropriate. I'm just saying, do we pay enough attention to how the person is going to interact with family, friends, how they're going to continue to engage in their social activity whilst being hoisted? Remember, there's always that kind of saying of occupational therapists, um, don't just help the person live, we're the ones who engage in the living. So, the things that make life meaningful, how do we continue to do that as part of our moving and handling assessment and handling plan? And then coming on to what's being used. So we talked earlier about the sort of tool that I use to go through that idea of person being ambulant right through to being using a passive full body hoist. But understanding what equipment's available is really important. So non-mechanical stand aid being the bit of equipment that helps somebody stand, so they can often pull up into standing, but they may not be able to support their stand when they're there. And I think non-mechanical stand aids, or certainly when we're delivering the training, are one of the most underused or ill-used bits of equipment on the market. And the reason I'm saying that is because they do so much more than people tend to use them for. So I see so many bits of equipment like, say, the return, where it's being used without the belt, or without the strap that goes under the bottom, which firstly inhibits kind of the idea of reducing care packages and single-handed care, because what you then see is a carer stabilizing the aid and another person kind of helping the person up into standing, which shouldn't be required. So understanding what non-mechanical stand aids are and actually how they're meant to be used and how that supports an informal carer maybe to use them safely, which then increases dignity, engagement in occupation, all those things that I'm trying to talk about. So understand the equipment. Your mechanized standing hoists, understand what they are, what they do, what the differences are. There's so many different variants on the marketplace. I know, probably 10 years ago, I would have said, I just don't like mechanized stand aids. I can never get them to work properly. I end up feeling like they're supporting an approved drag lift. But that's not my viewpoint anymore because I've explored what equipment's available. I've been on and delivered training about how to use them. I understand that different stand aids ergonomically do different things for different people who have different strengths or challenges based on my activity analysis. They have different widths, turning circles, lengths, which means that some can be used in very small downstairs toilet spaces that wouldn't have been able to be used before. So really get to know the product. I think it's very important. And then when somebody is needing to be full body hoisted or passive hoisted, there are so many options. So you've got the passive mobile hoist, which I think people are generally very familiar with. So the sort of equipment that's moved around on the floor is generally used by two carers, although it doesn't have to be. There's no rules that say they have to be. But from a risk management perspective, more often than not is. Then you've got your gantry hoist systems, which absolutely can be used by one person, but are uh, floor fixed or in specific places, not tend to be used on a temporary basis. So because transfers can only take place in that area, but they're very good for assessment purposes, certainly, and can absolutely be used in the long term, but they tend to lead to gantry track, to ceiling track hoisting systems. So let's think about design considerations for all of those bits of equipment, and think about how that changes depending on what's being used. So the hoist type influences space planning. So let's say, for example, you're using a mobile passive hoist. The space that you need in there is much more significant. They tend to be longer. They tend to have legs that need to open and widen around furniture and items, which means their turning circles are far greater. If you're using a gantry system, then you don't need turning circle space, but you need to consider what the footprint is. So they tend to have reasonably sized plates that give them the stability at the end of each leg. If you're using gantry, um, if you're using seal and track hoisting systems, you don't need that floor space at all. No turning circles. It's then just about integrity of the ceiling. So it's understanding the equipment and then how that influences what space you're planning for. The aesthetic and integration. So we often get that feedback of, especially if someone's using a hoist for the very first time. So let's say as part of discharge planning, and essentially they brought this crane towards them, what they perceive to be a crane, and it can be very intimidating. Their anxiety over that use has a big impact, therefore, on care planning, on engagement and activity, their well-being and how happy they are. And regardless of how familiar they then become with that bit of equipment, if it's used all the time, how it's integrated in their daily routine can often be a bit cumbersome, or they have to modify their routines as a result. User comfort and dignity. So the dignity perspective, how many people are needing to use it and how frequently, how positionally are they needing to be in it? So what kind of sling are you using? How have you sized it? How are you using the leg straps to make sure that knees are brought together in certain circumstances? But then if the person's needing to be moved onto a shower chair commode, say, for example, or onto a commode or directly down into a toilet, you're not necessarily wanting to pull knees together, particularly for men. So it's how are you managing your moving and handling plan in a dignified way, whilst also remembering that their comfort within that is absolutely paramount. So how often is the sling needing to be removed and replaced? Are you taking tissue viability into consideration? As an occupational therapist, I'm not a tissue viability nurse, but if I need that advice, I'll go and get it. But I'm very aware that I have a role within the comfort side of that to make sure that their skin integrity is still maintained. Depending on what hoist you're using, has a significant impact on what flooring you're recommending. So anything that's mobile and floor, so your stand aids, certainly the mechanized stand aids where you're needing to pull them out and turn them 90 degrees, and the same with your passive hoist. The type of flooring can have a significant impact. So if you've got a thick pile carpet and somebody who is, they don't even have to be relatively heavy, but somebody who is a bit taller and or carrying a little bit more weight, the maneuverability of that can be very different. So we might be recommending a change in flooring to hard flooring, for example. You don't have to think about any of those things with gantry or seal and track, but that presumes the person is needing those things. Some of the non-mechanized stand aids, most of them actually have 90-degree pivot tables within them. So as much as they are affected by the flooring, they're potentially affected less unless the carpet is very thick and therefore gets in the way and creates resistance for that turn. And certainly internal circulation and thoroughfares. We sometimes go and do reviews for organizations or care agencies where they're saying something isn't working and they're transporting someone on a transfer aid. That is absolutely not what transfer aids are for, whether it be non-mechanized stand aids, mechanized stand aids, or passive mobile hoists. They are transfer aids only. So they should not be going from room to room. But they do have to be moved from room to room without the person in them. So it's thinking about doorway widths. I've seen so many, I live in a rural area. I've seen so many rural cottages where we actually physically couldn't get a mobile hoist out of a doorway and turned through the corridor to get it into the next room because the corridors and the turn circles were so small. So all those things have to be built in as part of your plan. Now they can lead to multiple bits of equipment in multiple spaces, depending on what it is you're planning, or then things like specialist seating need to come into play if the person isn't going to be moved a lot because of those environmental restrictions. And I suppose what I'm linking all this to is what I use as part of my reflection, or if a case gets a bit more challenging, is PEO. So the person, the environment, and the occupations that they're engaging in, and working out then where optimal occupational performance, occupational engagement is, where all of those things overlap. So a brief look at what different ceiling track solutions there are. So when we get to this stage, it's then, do we know what they are? Now, I want to caveat that here with, we can't be expected to be experts in everything. We are experts in occupational therapy wherever we're applying that. I'm obviously speaking to the occupational therapists there. And whoever you are watching this, you are an expert in whatever it is you do. You can't be expected to know and understand how every home modification or adaptation is going to work, how every hoist works in its intricate details, and certainly what all of the seal and track solutions are out there are available for. And that's why we have excellent companies and relationships with companies who can provide us with that support. So I see my role here as being able to go to a company and say, look, I've got this situation, I've got this person, these are their needs, this is their activity analysis, these are the bits that I'm concerned they're able to do or not able to do. And it's led me to the conclusion that the person needs, in this instance, a seal and track solution. But I want it to be able to either go from room to room for these reasons, or I think it's going to need to be multiple single sections for these reasons. What do you think? You're the expert in that adaptation, and then allowing them to provide you with that support. What they shouldn't be doing, or what we shouldn't be doing, is going to them and saying, "Can you help me with this assessment? I'm not really sure. I need this assessment. I don't know how to do this." Our job is to provide the moving and handling assessment, the assessment of the individual from an occupational perspective, thinking about that PEO, and then going to them to ask for that expert equipment or adaptation advice. So that I want to caveat that with this. However, some basic knowledge is really useful. So understanding that one of the solutions could be multiple single sections, so single straight sections in different rooms, or maybe only one room. Sometimes if I've done that, it's been because there's an issue of space and getting something out from one room to another, or where actually the need isn't particularly complex. I'm just looking long term at the person being able to get out of bed and then being able to transfer into an armchair or something in a different room, and not wanting multiple different bits of equipment, or certainly not wanting the person to be sitting in their wheelchair for a prolonged period of time. Room covering systems, so these might be systems that are on frames where it gives you coverage across the whole room. So they tend to be sliding gantry bars, and then the system that moves underneath it. So it gives you access to the full room. So hoisting can be supported anywhere within that space. So on that picture that you see there, the second system, so through the doorway, is the kind of system I'm talking about there. You can just see a bar at the far edge. So it allows this traverse bar to move across the whole room whilst the unit moves in the other direction. Single rail systems tend to be used when people are traveling across longer spaces. So maybe down corridors. My experience is that they tend to see them in more institutional environments and less in the home environment, unless the home environment is really big. If that happens, my experience tends to be that we use a combination system or room traverse. And the combination system is like the one you're seeing in the image there, where something takes the person across the room, and then there are systems in place that link one system to another safely, sometimes using magnets or other kind of linkages to give person access to multiple rooms or multiple spaces within a home. But all of these things depend on what you're determining the person's occupational engagement is within certain rooms, what's meaningful to them, how they want to engage and how they want to do that safely. These kind of systems, if you think that combination system, if that was managed in a single-handed way, essentially you're helping that person engage in any activity across certainly one floor and potentially with the person that they live with, if they're competent and able to do that, regardless of when carers may or may not come in. So there are so many options available, but it has to come from that occupationally focused, client-centered risk assessment. And a brief thing about proportionate handling there, like I say, I've said a couple of times, we've done a separate webinar on proportionate handling, but it is such an important opportunity, firstly for local authorities to put resources back into the system and ultimately a longer term save money, although money saving from our perspective shouldn't be the primary reason, but there's so many opportunities from our perspective to maximize dignity, to use it to help maximize engagement in occupations and meaningful activities. So if you're not aware of how to do that or what to do, I would absolutely recommend you or the organisation source some training in how to support carers and your organisation in looking at that in more depth. But like I say, there's a complete separate webinar on how that works and what to do. So in summary, we've reflected on how to determine if hoisting is required and that kind of checklist that I use. There are others, but it's just that idea of we need to work out how we determine what's needed in the first instance. We've considered risk assessment process from an occupational perspective. We've discussed hoisting options and the impact of the environment and vice versa, the impact of the environment on hoisting options. And we've done a very brief refresh understanding of proportionate handling and the impacts, although there's much more detail on a separate webinar. I hope that's been useful for everyone, and now's the opportunity for me to answer any questions live. Thanks very much for attending.